Did you know that jazz legend Sun Ra claimed he was from Saturn and tried to erase his past on Earth? From shocking police raids to secret FBI files, here are 20 shocking scandals jazz legends tried to hide. 1. Miles Davis, police brutality. Incident. Miles Davis was not only a jazz artist, but a revolution unto himself. With his cool, groundbreaking trumpet, he revolutionized jazz forever. But in 1959, he experienced a frightful moment that revealed just how perilous life could be, even for a celebrity. It occurred outside Birdland, a legendary jazz club in New York City. Davis was between sets, standing outside and conversing with a friend. He was not in any trouble, just enjoying the evening. But as soon as a police officer caught sight of him, he instructed Davis to move along. Davis, aware of his rights, refused. After all, he had played inside the club that evening. Why did he need to move along? What followed was horrifying. The officer assaulted him, and soon officers were piling on. Davis was beaten to a pulp, left bruised and bloody. To add insult to injury, rather than finding justice, he was arrested. The experience was not only hurtful, it was humiliating. A man who had spent his life devoted to music was treated as a criminal simply because he was a black man standing outside of a club. Davis discussed the attack numerous times, yet he never received the apology that he was due. The attack made him bitter towards law enforcement and racism in America. Even so, he kept on making history with his music, demonstrating that no amount of violence would silence his brilliance. 2. Charlie Parker's battle with addiction. If jazz has a bad boy, he is Charlie "Bird" Parker. His saxophone soloing was the first thing anyone had ever heard, fast, inventive, and full of fire. He was among the pioneers of bebop, a new kind of jazz that revolutionized the genre. Yet behind the music, Parker was battling a war he couldn't possibly hope to win: heroin addiction. Parker's use of drugs began when he was young. As with many musicians during his era, he thought heroin made him play better, allowing him to stay awake and alert for extended performances. But addiction is not concerned with how good you are. It ruins it all. Initially, Parker was able to cope with his job, but shortly after, the drugs got a hold of him. He flunked appearances, arrived late, or would not appear at all. He became unpredictable, and club owners began to view him as unreliable. Even his closest friends could not always assist him. Parker's addiction was so bad at one point that he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. His body was breaking down and his mind was deteriorating. He attempted to quit numerous times, but the addiction always seemed to bring him back. His career, which could have been filled with even more success, was instead marred by disorder. In 1955, at just 34 years old, Parker's body finally gave out. Years of drug and alcohol abuse had weakened him beyond repair. When doctors examined him, they thought he was much older. His body had aged faster than his years. Parker's demise was a great loss for jazz. He had so much more to offer, but drug addiction took his future away from him. 3. Louis Armstrong's secret FBI file. Louis Armstrong was not only one of history's most legendary jazz musicians, the globe's biggest icon. With his authoritative trumpet, gruff voice, and such classic hits as "What a Wonderful World" and "Hello, Dolly," he became an all-time greatest entertainer in history. Meanwhile, however, behind the public's adoring gaze, the United States government was keeping an eagle eye on him. Why? Armstrong didn't mince words. Back in 1957, at the height of the civil rights movement, there was a major crisis in Little Rock, Arkansas. 9 black students, called the Little Rock Nine, were attempting to integrate an all-white high school. But the governor of the state wouldn't allow them in, and President Dwight Eisenhower wasn't doing much to intervene. Armstrong was angry. He accused Eisenhower of being two-faced and having no guts for not acting sooner. This was a big thing, At a time when most black performers kept their mouths shut about politics to safeguard their careers, Armstrong talked. The government did not approve of that. The FBI began to maintain a secret file on Armstrong, tracking his activities and associations. They viewed him as a potential threat, particularly since he was close friends with civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. Although Armstrong never got arrested or punished directly, he was aware that he was under surveillance. Despite this pressure, Armstrong never gave up. He subsequently went to Africa as a cultural ambassador, taking the world the best of American music while continuing to struggle for equality at home. 4. Billie Holiday's arrest over Strange Fruit. Billie Holiday's voice was pure magic. Her rendition of songs such as God Bless the Child and Lover Man made her one of the greatest emotional and powerful jazz singers ever. But there was one song, though, that landed her in real trouble: Strange Fruit. Strange Fruit was not a song. It was a protest. It told of the ghastly lynching of black Americans in the South, with haunting lyrics of bodies hanging from trees. The song was raw and emotive, and when Holiday sang it, she ensured the listeners felt each of the words. But the government did not want others to hear it. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics and the FBI, headed by Harry Anslinger, viewed Holiday as a problem. Anslinger was racist and resented seeing a black woman have so much power. He chose to destroy her. Rather than going after her for the song, the FBI went after her for using drugs. Holiday was addicted to heroin, and the government took advantage of that as a reason to arrest her repeatedly. They pursued her relentlessly, ensuring that she could never get away. They eventually got what they had been asking for in 1947. She was arrested, tried, and imprisoned for almost a year. When she was released, she was prohibited from performing at clubs that dispensed liquor, which ruined her career. Even when she passed away in the hospital years later, the FBI continued to have agents tailing her. Holiday passed away in 1959, only 44 years old. Many feel the relentless harassment by the government played a role in her demise. Despite it all, Strange Fruit turned into one of the most significant protest songs ever, demonstrating music's potential to reveal injustice. 5. Duke Ellington's financial troubles. Duke Ellington is among the best jazz composers ever. His tunes, such as Take the A Train and Mood Indigo, determined the course of jazz. He was the leader of one of the best-known big bands of all time, touring the globe and achieving enormous success. But even with all the recognition, there was one thing he failed to master: money. Ellington battled financial woes his entire career. Most musicians figured a person of his caliber would be rich, but he habitually squandered his income. Maintaining a large band was costly, and to ensure he had a band to work with, he borrowed money frequently. At times, he could only afford to pay his musicians minuscule amounts, and his debts mounted. His financial difficulties were exacerbated by his willingness to give. Ellington was famous for assisting underprivileged musicians, even when he couldn't spare the money. Rather than living in a state of personal enrichment, he invested his money in his music again, sometimes to his detriment. Although he never did become outright bankrupt, Ellington's financial issues were a constant struggle. 6. John Coltrane's addiction battles. John Coltrane is one of the greatest saxophonists in the history of jazz. His revolutionary playing style and albums such as A Love Supreme redefined jazz forever. But before he was a legend, he almost lost everything to heroin addiction. During the early part of his career, Coltrane's use of drugs was a major issue. He was a member of Miles Davis's band, which was one of the top bands in jazz. But his heroin addiction caused him to be unpredictable and inconsistent in his performances. Davis, who himself had been addicted, finally reached his limit and let him go. This might have marked the end of Coltrane's career, but instead it was a turning point. In 1957, he went cold turkey on heroin, cutting himself off and enduring a brutal detoxification. He became highly spiritual afterwards, feeling that he had been saved by some divine power. His subsequent music also showed this, with the motifs of faith and redemption dominating his work. Coltrane's change was impressive. He transformed from a struggling addict to one of the most respected musicians in the world. However, for a period, his addiction almost annihilated all he had achieved. 7. Bessie Smith's mysterious death. Bessie Smith, the Empress of the Blues, was among the strongest voices in early jazz and blues. Nobody knows you when you're down and out, and St. Louis blues made her a star. She was bold, frank, and among the first black women to gain national recognition. But her demise is still one of the most disputed tragedies in jazz history. In 1937, Smith was involved in a horrific automobile accident while passing through Mississippi. She was left severely injured and in dire need of medical aid. This marks the beginning of the mystery. For years, a horrific rumor circulated that Smith was refused treatment at a whites-only hospital and passed away as a result. The tale was widely accepted, igniting outrage over racial discrimination in America. Many interpreted her passing away as a sad testament to how black artists were treated unjustly, even in matters of life and lifelessness. Later accounts, though, disputed this argument. According to some witnesses, she was taken to a black hospital but was so badly hurt that she could not survive. There is no clear-cut answer yet, and the controversy still sticks as part of her legacy. What is certain is that Smith's contribution to jazz and blues was immense. She broke those barriers, inspired generations of musicians to come, and became an icon of both success and tragedy in the history of jazz. 8. Chet Baker's brutal beating. Chet Baker was as cool and great a jazz artist as there ever was. His smooth trumpet blowing and gentle, haunting vocals endeared him to people everywhere. But in the 1960s, his career almost ended most horrifically. Baker had a history of drug dependency that went back many years, and at one time, he owed the wrong people money. One evening, a group of drug dealers beat him up, broke his teeth, and left him severely battered. For a trumpet player, losing your teeth is a catastrophe. It's almost impossible to play with them. Most believed that Baker was done. He was gone from the jazz scene for a time, unable to make a comeback. But in a turn of events, he did not quit. He took years to relearn his craft, adjust his style, and ultimately return to the stage. 9. Thelonious Monk's mental health struggles. Thelonious Monk was a musical genius. His unconventional piano playing and irregular rhythms made him one of the greatest musicians ever. But although his music was full of energy, his life was full of problems. Monk's actions were frequently regarded as quirky. He would occasionally interrupt a performance to stop playing and just sit there, staring off into space. Other times, he would go silent for days on end or behave bizarrely in public. At first, folks assumed it was all just part of his artistic temperament, but eventually it became apparent that there was more at play. Monk had bipolar disorder, a form of mental illness that made him experience mood swings. He had days when he was full of energy and creative inspiration, coming up with beautiful music. Some days, however, he retreated and couldn't function or even talk. As he got older, the condition worsened, and he became more and more withdrawn from the world. Unfortunately, mental health care during his time was not as advanced, and Monk never got the assistance he needed. Despite his turmoil, his contribution to jazz was unmistakable. 10. Ella Fitzgerald. Ella Fitzgerald is referred to as the First Lady of Song for good reason. She had a lovely voice and phenomenal talent, making her the greatest of all-time jazz singers. Even she, however, wasn't immune to controversy. Fitzgerald was in Houston, Texas in 1955 when events went haywire. She was backstage with great trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie when police raided the club unexpectedly. The authorities were suspected of searching for illegal gambling, and to everyone's surprise, they arrested Fitzgerald, Gillespie, and other members of their band. The arrest was humiliating. Fitzgerald was a highly regarded artist and a beloved figure, and the thought of her being arrested and sent to jail shocked the jazz community. Most suspected the raid was racially motivated, as black artists were frequently unfairly targeted by the police during the time. Even though the charges were eventually dismissed, the incident left her with a permanent blemish on her career. Fitzgerald seldom discussed it, instead concentrating on her music. She went on to receive 13 Grammy Awards and become one of the greatest singers of all time, showing that no scandal could tarnish her star. 11. Count Basie's tax issues. Count Basie was among the best band leaders in jazz. With his easy piano playing and swing-type big band, he was a household name. His music delighted millions and his impact crossed generations. But as he was amusing the world, he was also facing a monumental financial nightmare, trouble with the IRS. Like many artists, Basie cared about his music over his money. Throughout his lifetime, he paid little in the way of taxes. And in no time at all, he had the IRS on his heels. The money was so outstanding that he simply had no alternative but to keep playing, even when he just wanted to taper off. While other artists retire in their golden years to bask in their achievements, Basie could not do the same. He was still on tour during his 70s, playing shows just to cover what he owed. Fans were witnessing a jazz legend delivering unforgettable performances, but in the background, he was struggling to survive. 12. Fats Waller's Mafia Kidnapping. Fats Waller was a larger-than-life jazz pianist and vocalist. His playing was infused with energy, humor, and charm, and he was one of the most popular musicians of his day. Yet in the 1920s, he had a conflict with the mafia that became one of the wildest jazz tales ever. One evening, while departing a gig, Waller was abducted by a group of men armed with guns and thrown into a vehicle. Frightened, he didn't know what was going on until they reached their destination. As it turned out, he had just been invited to play at a private bash for none other than notorious gangster Al Capone. The party was in full force, and Capone's associates informed Waller that he wouldn't be going anywhere until he played. With no other option, he sat down at the piano and began playing. The party continued for 3 consecutive days, with Waller playing around the clock as gangsters partied around him. He was initially afraid, but the more time he spent with them, the more he understood that Capone was indeed a big fan of his work. The gangsters treated him to a full meal, supplied him with fine liquor, and even filled his pockets with bundles of $1,000 tips. When he was eventually released, he was loaded with stacks of cash. Though Waller joked about it afterwards, what happened is that he was abducted by possibly the most dangerous crime lord the world has ever seen. It's one of those strange anecdotes that sounds as though it wouldn't happen except in a Hollywood movie. But Waller lived through it. 13. Sarah Vaughan's abusive marriage. Sarah Vaughan, affectionately referred to as the Divine One, possessed one of the most unbelievable voices in jazz history. She had a breathtaking vocal range and an ability to bring any song to life emotionally. But whereas listeners loved her, she was quietly struggling in her private life. Vaughan's marriage to trumpeter-turned-manager George Treadwell was a nightmare. Initially, he mentored her career, but with time he took over fully in her finances and decision-making. He ensured all the money passed through him, and Vaughan had minimal say over what she did with her own money. Worse yet, their union has been described as abusive, both physically and emotionally. Treadwell abused her in private, and since he controlled her career, she was almost impossible to leave. She suffered through this abusive relationship for years, all while entertaining her audiences who had no sense that she was suffering through this. Later on, Vaughn gathered the strength to quit Treadwell, but he had spent most of her money by then. She had to restart her career alone, demonstrating that her talent was sufficient enough to keep her on top. 14. Jelly Roll Morton's Lost Fortune. Jelly Roll Morton was among the first of jazz's pioneers. A master pianist and composer, he was instrumental in establishing the sound of jazz during its formative years. His distinctive style blended ragtime and blues, and he even boasted that he had invented jazz himself. Whether or not that was the case, there's no question that he had an impact. But for all of his talent, Morton's own life turned tragically. In the 1920s, he made a large fortune performing at clubs and cutting records, but his success only lasted for so long. Shady deals, poor business investments, and changes in the industry left him near poverty. As big band and swing jazz gained popularity, Morton's retro style began to wane. The record labels ceased contacting him, and he was forced out of the business he had invented. To add insult to injury, he never received the compensation that he was entitled to for many of his works. Without the wealth that he was entitled to, he gradually descended into poverty. In his later years, Morton attempted a comeback, but it was too late. He passed away in 1941, almost forgotten by the music world. It wasn't until many years later that they understood how crucial he was to the history of jazz. 15. Buddy Bolden's mental breakdown. Buddy Bolden was a real pioneer of jazz. Prior to Louis Armstrong or Duke Ellington, Bolden was the one who was igniting New Orleans with his distinctive trumpet playing. He played loudly and with unbelievable vigor, getting people to dance in ways never seen before. It is said that many give him credit for inventing the foundation of today's jazz. But in private, Bolden's life was falling apart. He had extreme mental illness issues, which were probably symptoms of schizophrenia. Initially, his actions were merely perceived as weird. He would vanish for days, be unpredictable, and be paranoid. But as the years passed, things got worse. One afternoon in 1907, Bolden simply broke down. He was so unstable that his family was forced to have him committed. He was sent to the Louisiana State Insane Asylum, where he spent the remainder of his life, more than 24 years. He never played an instrument again, vanishing from the face of jazz before he could ever be properly acknowledged. By the time jazz burst on the scene, Buddy Bolden was forgotten. He had no records, and his work was nearly lost to history. Today, historians and musicians strive to keep his name alive, reminding the world that he was the first real jazz legend, even though he never lived to enjoy his success. 16. Sidney Bechet's Shootout in Paris. Sidney Bechet was another jazz mastermind, famous for his phenomenal talent on the clarinet and soprano saxophone. His music was vibrant, with a rapid, passionate style that set him apart. He performed with legends such as Louis Armstrong and became one of the first jazz musicians to achieve success in Europe. But Bechet was not only renowned for his music, he also had a famous temper. One day in 1928, while he lived in Paris, he argued with a fellow musician, which turned into a fight. This was not your ordinary fight, it was a fight about music kind of thing. Bechet would not stand having his playing critiqued, and soon the whole thing escalated beyond control. Before anyone could intervene, the fight escalated into an all-out shootout in Paris streets. Bechet and the other musicians shot at one another, but rather than striking their marks, they injured innocent people. The police arrested Bechet immediately, and he was put behind bars. The event created a scandal, and Bechet was eventually deported from France. But that did not stop his career. He went on to play and is now considered one of the greatest jazz musicians of all time. Later in life, returned to France, where he was greeted as a musical hero. 17. Cab Calloway's fist fight with Dizzy Gillespie. Cab Calloway was one of the greatest jazz band leaders of all time. Famous for his larger-than-life personality, crazy dance steps, and hits such as Minnie the Moocher, he was a 1930s and 1940s superstar. Behind the scenes, however, Calloway had a reputation as a tough taskmaster with his band members, occasionally too tough. Among them was a young Dizzy Gillespie, who went on to become the pioneer of the bebop jazz. But then, he was merely another musician with Calloway's band. The two had frequent disagreements, but one night backstage in 1941, things took an unexpected turn. Calloway blamed Gillespie for botching a performance, and the altercation soon escalated into an all-out brawl. Insults were hurled, followed by punches, and before anybody could intervene, Gillespie brandished a knife and stabbed Calloway in the leg. The altercation was so severe that Gillespie was sacked from the group on the spot. But the irony of events was that it benefited him. Without the weight of Calloway bringing him down, Gillespie embarked on creating bebop, the revolutionary jazz style that revolutionized music for the ages. While Calloway continued to entertain, becoming one himself, their brutal brawl remained one of the biggest scandals of jazz history. 18. Ornette Coleman's near lynching. Ornette Coleman was among the most groundbreaking musicians in jazz. He experimented with music and developed free jazz, a genre of music that did not adhere to conventional rules. It was adored by some, but hated by others because it sounded like noise. Sadly, that hatred almost took his life away. In the 1950s, when he was not yet well known, Coleman was performing in his hometown of Fort Worth, Texas. His music was innovative, full of strange notes and rhythms that were unfamiliar to most people. Rather than enjoying his brilliance, some of his audience members were enraged. One evening, some furious men attacked him purely based on not being pleased with how he played. They beat him mercilessly and even attempted to lynch him. It was a terrible scene that could have cut short his career or even his life. But Coleman would not be silenced. Rather than give up, he relocated to Los Angeles and continued to play his music, ultimately receiving fame for his revolutionary style. He is now one of the most influential jazz musicians in history, showing us that innovation sometimes is accompanied by adversity. 19. Etta James's drug addiction battles. Etta James had one of the most powerful voices in music history. Known for songs like At Last and I'd Rather Go Blind, she blended blues, R&B, and jazz effortlessly, earning her a place among the greatest vocalists of all time. But while her music soared, her personal life was full of struggle. Heroin became Etta's greatest foe. She began taking it as a teenager and soon found herself hooked. The addiction spawned numerous arrests, terminated friendships, and numerous trips to rehab. She was so desperate for narcotics that she was even resorting to stealing and writing bad checks to enable her habit. No matter how hard it was, Etta persevered. She went into rehab multiple times, but it wasn't until the late 1980s that she was able to get clean. Even after beating addiction, she still had the marks of her past, but she never allowed it to deter her from performing. Her raw, emotional singing came from true pain, and that's why her music is so unforgettable. 20. Sun Ra's secret identity. Sun Ra wasn't simply a musician. He was enigmatic. He wore space attire, composed avant-garde tunes, and told people he didn't come from Earth. No, he supposedly hailed from Saturn and was among the chosen artists sent to salvage humanity with song. But the truth? He was born Herman Poole Blount in Birmingham, Alabama. He attempted to wipe out that past, even going so far as to legally change his name to Sun Ra. He would not discuss his childhood, never mentioning Alabama or his early years. Why the secrecy? A few guess that it was due to the racism he encountered in the South. To be black as a child in early 20th century Alabama was to endure segregation, discrimination, and limited prospects. By inventing an entirely new identity for himself, he escaped that painful history and constructed a world in which he could be whatever he desired. Sun Ra's music was as unorthodox as his existence. He blended jazz with experimental music, recorded one of the first completely electronic jazz albums ever made, and commanded a band that adhered to his every celestial decree. Some people believed he was insane, but others regarded him as a visionary genius before his time.